Well, thank you very much. And it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. And good morning to everybody in Essen. I'm just sorry I can't be with you in person. So I'm going to spend the next 20 minutes or so giving you a little bit of a perspective on this really important topic of standards and how Responsible Steel has approached it. By way of background, Responsible Steel started in a discussion in Australia when the Australian steel industry were looking at standardizing the sustainability expectations of the industry. The discussion went along the lines of, look, you're doing something in Australia, it looks great. There's also a movement going on in Europe. And this was 10 years ago. Why do we want to have these separate standards? Why don't we make an international standard? And so a few more people got involved in the conversation, those who've been involved in Forest Stewardship Council, FSC, probably the best known international certification standard. And they decided to design a certification and standard scheme which would be credible, international, and multi-stakeholder. And so that's where we today have Responsible Steel, started in about 2016. And we spent the last 6 years building our standard and certification program, and just as importantly, building a multi-stakeholder consensus around the topic. It's not a straightforward topic, as I'm sure many of you know, and I'm going to take you through some of the details of how we've approached it. But first of all, let me just see if I can get my slides on the screen. There we go. So to start off, I don't think it really needs much from me to highlight the growing need for steel. We have an explosive need for renewable energy, for clean energy infrastructure, green hydrogen infrastructure, CCS. This will all need steel. And of course, if we look at the amount of steel that's available in the world, we see a very unequal distribution between developed countries and developing countries. So we know that infrastructure takes a lot of steel, and we also know we know that development, social development, and to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals needs a huge amount of steel. We also know that the transition to net zero is going to need huge amounts of steel. So the challenge, I think, is in this word need. That's the first challenge. Do we need to inject as much steel into the economy in developing countries as we have done in developed countries? And that's down to the industry to really innovate on the material efficiency and the way we use steel to be able to reuse it, to remanufacture it, as well as to recycle it. But beyond that, we still know that today we need around 2 billion tons of steel, and even the most ambitious projections and scenarios see the demand for steel in 2050 being around that number. Most scenarios believe we're going to be looking at 2.3, 2.5, some even 2.8 billion tons of steel per year. So if you look at this set of graphs here, you can see in Europe, the projections are we will level off. But in somewhere like India, we are looking at vast increases in steel production and consumption. In India, the projections are that the industry will triple its capacity by 2050 and double its capacity by 2030. So the question is, how are we going to make that steel? And if you look at the blue sliver along the bottom here, that represents the steel that can be made from stocks of scrap. In Europe, we have relatively plentiful stocks. Around half of our steel can be made with scrap. In the US, it's more like 70%, but in India, it's a very, very small proportion. So we know that most of the steel that will be the additional steel capacity that will come into play over the next 30, 35 years will be from primary production. And therefore, we need to tackle the emissions from that. We need to maximize the use of scrap. we need to capitalise on the stocks of scrap that are available, but we've also got to make sure that the emissions across the board, whether you're using scrap or iron ore, really plummet downwards. And whilst we're doing that, we have an enormous opportunity. We're going through an industrial transformation on a scale unprecedented and a speed unprecedented. So we have an enormous opportunity now to create a new steel industry, a steel industry that is responsible both environmentally and socially. And that is why responsible steel has come about, not looking just at decarbonisation, but also at the other elements of sustainability. Here on a snapshot on a slide, the challenge laid out. An increasing demand, global demand for steel, means that our emissions from our sector that are now 7% could rise to something like 12% by 2050, depending on what happens with other sectors, of course. But just if we're looking at the increase in production, we could be looking at a 25% increase in emissions. The price tag on decarbonisation looks something like $6 billion a year, and the scale of the challenge, 84% reduction across the board, across the global industry, not forgetting that the growth in the industry is going to be in developing countries. The Mission Possible Partnership has done some excellent work on scenarios looking at net zero by 2050 and keeping within a 1.5 degree envelope. And in order to do that, their projections are that we need 170 million tonnes of near zero capacity, not just reduced emission steel, but near zero capacity by 2030 if we're going to be on a 1.5 degree trajectory. I believe it's as hot in Essen today as it is in London. We're going to get these reminders more and more often about just how important it is to remain within a 1.5 degree envelope. But it's a huge, huge challenge. And whilst we're doing that, we know that today, 2025, 30% of steel is made from scrap. And in 2050, the estimates from the IEA and the World Steel Association are that we'll only be able to generate around half of our steel from scrap. So what we really need is to create a new economics for steel. We need to ensure that green steel, net zero steel, near zero steel, and is responsible. And we need to ensure that that responsible green steel is more economical to produce than higher emission steel. That's it. That's what we need to achieve. We know that the demand signal is an important part of that. We know that there's a severe need for policy intervention to change the economics of steelmaking. And we know that the finance sector can also play an incredibly important role in incentivizing green steel over high emission steel. And in order to do that effectively in a streamlined way, most efficiently, these efforts need to be underpinned by a common definition of what green steel or near zero steel is. We believe that definition should include responsibility, and it needs to have a common measurement standard, a common set of rules for how we're measuring the embodied emissions of steel. Today, we have too many ways to measure this, and it's incredibly difficult for a bank or a customer to look at 2 different suppliers, 3 different suppliers, and know that they're giving consistent metrics. So responsible steel, as I said, was designed to create that common standard. We started discussions 10 years ago or so. By 2016, we'd formed the organization, and today we have nearly 150 members. And our membership is very broad. I'll show you a snapshot of that in a minute. But we have 15% of the global steel market by volume in membership. And we have now produced a single international standard for the responsible production and sourcing of steel. Alongside that, we run an independent assurance program that provides certification for the steelmakers that they can pass on to their customers to show that they've been through a rigorous process to assure compliance with our standard. So it's not just steelmakers that are in our membership. We have a very important set of steel processors, steel buyers, and we have raw material suppliers, financial institutions, technology providers, trade associations, trade unions, and some. Our constitution actually requires us to have a balance of civil society and business members. And this is a really important part of our DNA. So when we're developing the standard, when we're debating the elements of the standard, we are bringing in these different perspectives to ensure that what we come up with is one that is based on the consensus that we've been able to build. And that's why it's taken such a long time to develop our standard. It took 3 years to develop our first standard. And when it came to carbon, we said, let's take this as a separate project. And that took another 3 years. The same for responsible sourcing, not an easy subject. Civil society would like the industry to change overnight. The industry has asked for a more practical, pragmatic, and constructive roadmap towards responsible sourcing. Today, it's very difficult to trace all your raw materials. So that is another transition that needs to happen alongside decarbonisation, and our standard allows for that. Our strategic mission at Responsible Steel is not just about standards, it is to be a driving force in the socially and environmentally responsible production of steel, net zero steel, across the world. And in order to do that, we put a lot of store in the integrity of our work, in the integrity of the standard and our assurance program, and in our ability to listen and open our processes up to all stakeholders. In order for our standard to be effective and bring about the kind of decarbonisation that we want to drive, we work with our members and other stakeholders to really drive the demand for responsible steel amongst the banks, amongst civil society, amongst buyers of steel, and of course steel producers. And we work with governments and global initiatives on really driving harmonisation between standards. And I'll come on to that a little bit in a moment. So our standard cuts across the whole remit of sustainability, 13 different principles. And within those principles, 61 criteria over 500 requirements. So it's not a walk in the park. It's a very exacting standard, and it's based on existing best practice across the world. So it's makes a host of other standards, whether it's the GRI standard and SASB for disclosure, or the ILO conventions on labour rights. So it's not reinventing the wheel where other good work is being done. And we believe that's a really important part of the process of developing an international standard. Indeed, it's part of the WTO 6 principles for standard development. Our assurance program is run by independent certification bodies who are approved by us, auditors that are trained by us. They have to take our exam. And we have an independent assurance panel that provides a judgment of the certification decision in high-risk cases. We have an oversight mechanism to ensure those audits are of good quality and consistent quality. Today, we've got 61 sites certified across the world, 110 million tonnes of steel capacity covered by that certification, and nearly 170,000 workers covered by certification on labour standards. We've got a huge pipeline of certification coming through, which will bring in other continents as well. So it's a very busy time at Responsible Steel in the certification program. And what I want to just spend a couple of minutes highlighting is how this standard works across different ESG elements. We have a basic core certification. That is what the 69 sites today have already achieved. That's against all 13 principles of the standard. In addition to that, we are now offering 4 different levels of progress on 2 dimensions. One is the decarbonisation progress that we've been talking about at this conference, and the second is around responsible sourcing. In fact, when we go back to the origins of responsible steel, it was some of the automotive companies that highlighted the real risks in the supply chain, in the mine sites, in terms of social and environmental standards. So alongside decarbonisation progress, sites need to show responsible sourcing progress. They need to show transparency. They need to show commitment to responsible sourcing. On the decarbonisation side, on the left-hand side, you'll see what's probably a familiar slide scale to you, a scrap variable threshold and a set of 4 different thresholds for the decarbonisation of steel. We're not saying that each level is an absolute level of carbon intensity. It's a level of decarbonisation progress, because that's what we need to see. It's scrap variable to take into account the unequal distribution of scrap in the world, and to ensure that we're driving emissions reduction across the board, both in high iron ore content steel and in high scrap content steel. There's decarbonisation to be had across the board. But of course, what customers want to see is the product carbon footprint, and our standard ensures that certified sites also produce a carbon footprint for the products that they want to certify. On the responsible sourcing side, we ask for the company to make a commitment to responsible sourcing, to trace their upstream supply chains, to understand what the existing policies, commitments and performances of their upstream suppliers, and then to work with their suppliers to strengthen those commitments, to commit to one of our recognised ESG programs for raw materials. Currently, we recognise IRMA, the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, TSM, towards sustainable mining, and Better Coal. And there is a pipeline of other schemes to be assessed for approval too. And then finally, we ask the steel sites to work with their suppliers to report publicly on their responsible sourcing progress. So you can see this as a real roadmap, as I mentioned earlier, for the steel makers to really drive responsible sourcing. And we work also with the mining sector to ensure they're ready to respond to these demands. I mentioned the role of our stakeholders in driving demand for responsible steel, and indeed driving a demand for low emission steel that is responsible. They've chosen to use the responsible steel standard in their initiatives, the Climate Group Steel Zero Initiative and the First Movers Coalition, which will be announcing in a couple of weeks a new initiative, a near zero 2030 steel challenge, to really try and surface the supply and demand for near zero steel using the responsible steel standard. Civil society is getting increasingly focused on steel, and not just decarbonised steel, but responsible steel. So they are airing their voice with customers of steel, buyers of steel. This is an example in the automotive industry where they're saying, you really need to get behind these international standards and show your commitment, because you can help drive the change. And in the finance sector, there's an increasing use of decarbonisation metrics in sustainable loans, sustainable bonds, and so on. We've got $7.5 billion of credit at the moment that uses responsible steel certification as a metric in those credit facilities, credit lines. And there's a lot more discussion going on in the financial industry, both on the equity side and on the debt side, looking at how they can drive decarbonisation in their portfolios and do that in a responsible way. There are a lot of things that we still need to do. Our standard addresses scrap as one of the materials, the input materials, as part of the responsible sourcing program and progress. But on scrap, we don't have a body that we can reference or an initiative that we can reference that actually lays out the standards for the scrap industry. There are a number of different initiatives ongoing, and we're sponsoring the roundtable on responsible recycling of metals, to really map out those standards that exist, those initiatives that exist, and look at where the gaps are and what the need is for standards in the scrap supply chain. The scrap industry is incredibly variable across the world. In Europe and is different from the US, is very different from countries like India, where there's very little organized infrastructure at this stage, and even less so in Africa. But across the board, we need to be able to say, what should steelmakers expect of their scrap suppliers to reassure us that we're making responsible produced and responsibly sourced steel. What comes after a standard, a steel making standard? When you're buying steel, for those buyers in the audience, you'll know that there will be steps between the steel making site that you're procuring your steel from and the actual production line in which you make your own products. So how do we trace that certified steel from the certified site through to your facility? We need a chain of custody standard. We need to be able to audit at each step along the value chain that the flow of certified steel has been verified and has been when it's totaled up at the end user site, that's done according to a consistent set of rules. So if you're getting 50% of your steel from a certified site and 50% of your steel from a non-certified site, what can you say about the steel that's in your product? And that is a piece of work that we've been doing over the last 6-9 months, and we'll shortly be going out to a public consultation on that work. And that is an incredibly important part of bringing international standards for sustainability of steel actually to the market. And once that is available, then the market can start showing a value on that sustainably sourced steel. So that's all I've got to say at the moment. I'm sure there's lots of questions. I'm very happy to take questions. But before I do, I'd just like you to consider, I know the audience today is made up of quite a variety of different players in the steel value chain, but what role will you play in steel decarbonisation? Will you be talking about just green steel, a low emission steel, or will you be talking about responsible steel? Will you be including international standards in your procurement standards, specifications? What are you disclosing in terms of your metrics that can really drive change? How can you use international standards and certification to drive that change by asking for that disclosure and producing that disclosure? When you're looking for finance, how can you surface the work of your suppliers or your production sites in the metrics that you're negotiating with the banks? How can you better show your commitments to responsible green steel in the metrics that you disclose to your investors? So that's my provocation to you, but I'm sure you have many questions for me. I'll leave it there. Sebastian, thank you very much.
Annie, thank you very much for this very interesting presentation about responsible steel. We have now time to take some questions from the audience. But before we do that, just a quick antitrust reminder. So there should be no discussions in this room around competitors, pricing, alignment of future capacities, and anything else which could impede or hinder competition. So that, as MetalsHub, we take very important. So it's important that we state this here. And now I open the room for some questions to Annie. So Frank has a question. It's kind of getting a tradition that Frank gets to ask the first question.
I'm giving my best here. Annie, thank you very much for this great and interesting presentation. Now, there's one big elephant in the room. What are we doing about China with all of that? I saw on your map lots of parts of the world were included, South Korea, etc. I didn't see anything in China so far.
Great question. half of the world's steel is made in China, so it's right that you asked that question. I don't think we should presume that China is silent in this debate. Chinese steel industry is thinking very hard about standards and is working in a way that, from what I've seen, is a very, very well-informed and well thought through way. Whether they align with international standards is another question, but the analysis that's been done from within China, I think, is as good as anybody's in other parts of the world. So I think that there is very much a listening mode within the Chinese steel industry, looking at international standards. And from a responsible steel perspective, I can share with you that we have one site in China that has applied for a responsible steel audit. That's not yet in process, but that will be in the public domain at the time that's appropriate when they've gone through the initial stages. So we will be testing the water in China from our perspective, and we are in touch with Chinese counterparts on the alignment of standards. Because I think at the end of the day, where we don't have one international standard, we can have standards that harmonize and are interoperable as far as possible. Every government in the world is now looking at, or of the major steel economies is looking at a standard on low emission steel for one thing, and they're all looking at how they can interoperalize their standard with international standards. I think that's the important thing. The other thing to say is that ISO is on which a lot of the responsible steel standard is based, I should say. It is also something which is very, very visible to the Chinese, and they take that into account when they're looking at harmonization. I can't speak for them, but I think we are heading in the same direction.
Thank you, Annie. Any more questions from the audience?
Hi, Annie. I have a question for you. From your point of view, which are the regions or countries that will have the greatest impact in the next 10 to 15 years in terms of responsible steel?
Which are the countries? Was that the question? Which are the countries that will have the most impact?
Countries or regions?
That's a very good question. Because at the moment, and you can see this from my graph, there's no doubt about it that Europe is leading the way on responsible steel. I would turn that more into a challenge for us. Today we're a European community in this summit, but we are all working in an international market, whether we're buying raw materials or whether we're buying steel. Now, depending on how trade rules play out, we can assume, I would hope, that the market for steel remains an international market, and the trade in steel remains buoyant. And I think if we look at where steel is going to be produced more and more in the future, that's where we need to be focusing our efforts, because without that, we're not going to achieve our goals. So I look at it from a sustainability perspective. Where do we really need to bring the change? And for me, that's in developing countries. I've just spent a couple of weeks in India, where, as I said, steel production capacity is set to double by 2030, from 120 odd million tons to 300 million tons, in fact, by 2030. So that's where the change needs to happen, and that's going to be a big challenge, because today blast furnace technology is the cheapest, and that's the most easy route to invest, and if you're going to expand your capacity quickly. At the same time, the US is clearly, with the IRA, going to be scaling up production of at least green iron, if not green steel. So that is a big growth market. And I think, as I say, the potential for Europe to go from not just responsible steel, but to real near zero steel is second to none because of the policy thinking that we've had in Europe. But we have, as we know, in Europe to keep up with competition across the world, and that competition is nowhere less visible than in the policy domain, I think. So I can't answer your question. I can't look into a crystal ball in 10 years' time, but I do know where we need to be making that transition most poignantly.
Okay, thank you, Annie. There's, I think, another question here.
Yes. Hello, Ini. Thank you very much for this insightful presentation. My question revolves around different standards. So in your introduction today, we already heard for many it's a problem that there are still competing standards, or there's no one clear standard out there. What is your response to those, especially those that remain hesitant with respect to why they should still start working on this today, maybe especially pointing towards some no-regret moves or so?
Well, I think there's more alignment than it perhaps sometimes looks when we look at the media. There are voices that would like to, I think, overplay this multiplication of standards. In fact, those bodies that have been developing standards for many years have been working in an open way, listening to the good thinking that's gone before. I mentioned that Responsible Steel Standard builds on ISO. It builds on other standards. And one of the inputs into the Responsible Steel Standard was the World Steel Association methodology. We work closely with the World Steel Association to map out where our standards now differ and where we can try and close the gap. We're all moving at different time scales, but I think there is a strong will and desire to create interoperable standards in the next couple of years. This is something which the UNFCCC and the COP 26, in fact, launched, which is the Steel Breakthrough Agenda, and that's brought together ISO, World Steel, Responsible Steel, and the IDDI to work together to really try to ensure that our standards fit together, if they're not exactly one and the same, because they're built for different purposes. When it comes to actually certifying the emissions intensity in a ton of steel in a way that is comparable across the world, there is only one standard at the moment, and that's the Responsible Steel Standard. If you want to measure the emissions from a site or from a company, then you've got the GHG protocol, and there are various takes on it in ISO and World Steel Standard, World Steel Association standards. But if you're looking just to compare one ton of steel with another, that the Responsible Steel Standard is the only one that does that. A product carbon footprint will be specific to the product, and there's a great difference between a steel rod and a hot rolled coil. So comparability and consistency is what you need to look for when thinking of multiplication of standards. There's a lot more alignment than it might appear.
Thank you, Annie. It has been a great presentation. Great to have you here virtually. We here in the room are now going to take a 15-minute coffee break, and we're going to be back here at 10:45 with the Supplier of the Year Awards. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.